Hi, my name is Avi Staiman, and welcome to the Kickstart Your Career Kennis webinar series. I want to thank you for joining me here today with the goal of helping academic scholars, doctors, and researchers to publish their research in prestigious academic fora around the world. We all have research that we have been working on for months, if not years. Completed the questionnaire, the study, did hard work putting all the findings together, wrote it all down, and now we're looking to publish our research in the journal of our dreams. And the question is, how do we get there? My name is Avi Staiman, and I am the founder and CEO of a company called Academic Language Experts. And we help academic scholars to translate, edit, and format their research for publication in respected academic fora around the world. And this webinar, in the next 20 to 30 minutes, we're going to review what are the major points to look out for when we're preparing our research for publication, and how do we avoid some of the big pitfalls that tend to make publication a big challenge. So I want to start off by saying that publishing your research is difficult. It's really challenging. And if you've had rejection or your paper has been rejected, don't get down on yourself. You're together with 80% of all other researchers and academics around the world who face an uphill battle, an uphill climb when it comes to making sure that their research is ready for publication. I really enjoyed this picture, this cartoon on the left-hand side of the screen, where it shows how even after streamlining the new peer review process, it still feels like an impossible challenge to navigate the complex and windy process that is academic publication. So what I want to do in order to crack the code and in order to reveal the 7 secrets is I want to get into the mindset of why articles are rejected. And I think that if we can identify those factors, then we'll be able to be better prepared when we have our own research to make sure that it's up to date, it is compelling, it's new, and it is appealing for a potential journal. And this really should work across the broad spectrum of academic fields, from medicine and exact sciences to the humanities and social sciences. Now, I want to thank Professor Peter Thrower, who wrote a fascinating article on the 8 reasons why he rejects papers. He himself is a journal reviewer and is a journal editor and decides which papers are published and which are not. A lot of this presentation today is based on some of his recommendations. So let's jump right into it. So first of all, the first seemingly boring reason, but very critically important reason that articles are not published in our ideal journal is because they fail the technical screening. And oftentimes, scholars don't take enough time to go onto the website for the journal and take a look at the guide for authors. The guide for authors can sometimes be dozens of pages and be very intimidating. And it takes some time to sort of weave through and figure out what's critical, what's really important, and what might not be relevant to our specific case. So we want to go into the website of the journal. We want to find, first of all, what types of papers do they accept? In general, we think of first we write our paper, and then we go on a search, go on a hunt to try and find what's the best journal for our paper. And the truth is that sometimes that's not just sometimes, all the time, that's not necessarily the best approach. I would highly recommend, whenever possible, to first, before you even pick up your pen or before you start typing, to first search what journal am I going to publish in? Where would I want to publish in? Forget for a second how realistic it is or if it's going to be accepted right away. But what's my ideal dream journal? And once I have that, then I can see, okay, first of all, how many words, right? We see here that in Geoforum, which is a journal that deals with geography and urban studies. So they have a maximum of 9,000 words for their full papers. So I know if I want to write a full academic paper, I need to limit myself to well below 9,000 words. And the truth is that I recommend keeping it as short as possible because journals have a tendency, and the trend is going towards publishing shorter articles as opposed to longer ones. Yet I may not have enough materials in order to publish a full paper. And in that case, I might want to publish a critical review, which here tells me is 3,000 words. And that's a much shorter piece. And obviously in every journal, they have different types of publishing. So I need to familiarize myself. Now, one other point that I want to make already now is the idea of what formatting style do they call for. And it's really critical that we take the time to look out for their formatting requirements. And why is that? Sometimes formatting can be very slow and boring, seemingly boring work that doesn't seem so critical to our argument. And what I would suggest is simply that when we are submitting our article, we need to remember that we are competing against dozens, if not hundreds of other scholars for a place. Now, if we have taken the time to read through the Guide for Authors carefully, to make sure we understand all of the components, and to format and prepare our article according to the Guide for Authors, specifically in terms of the formatting and the bibliography, so it shows the journal that we really want to publish in this journal. We're not shopping our paper around and hoping to find the best fit, but rather we thought in advance about exactly where we want to publish, and we're demonstrating to them through the fact that it's prepared according to their style that we want to publish in this particular journal. Can it get accepted while not being formatted properly? Yes, it definitely can. But we want to give ourselves every chance to possibly succeed. Now, I want to point out that for further reading on any of the topics that we discussed today, you'll see that at the bottom of your screen, there are links to blogs that I've written and my colleagues have written, which hopefully will help you in navigating some of these topics and exploring them further. Now, the second big issue is whether the article fits the aims and scope of the journal. So here I took as an example from Nature Reviews, Endocrinology, and I brought the aims and scope. And what's really important about the aims and scope is it'll give you certain keywords, certain ideas for whether this journal is relevant for your research. Oftentimes scholars hear that their colleagues publish in a certain journal, so they want to publish there. Sometimes that's fine, and sometimes it's a bad idea. Sometimes ideally we want to be in a situation whereby we're looking for what exactly is the journal interested in. So for example, here, Nature Reviews, basic translational and clinical content by renowned basic and clinical academics and researchers targeted toward readers in the biological and medical sciences from postgraduate level upwards. So that gives us some important pieces of information. We know it needs to be in the biological and medical sciences. Obviously, we know it needs to be in the field. And we know that they'll accept anything from postgraduate and above. However, specifically what's interesting to me about this journal is that they want to, in the last line, they say, we aim to make all of our articles accessible to readers working in any biological or medical discipline. So we need to be careful already when we're writing our article to make sure that we are not writing in a jargon or with using terminology that is not going to be understood by the general medical population. And that gives us sort of some clues and some tips, which let us know, is this a relevant paper for this particular journal, and B, if I decide that it is the relevant paper and it is the relevant journal and the match is right, how do I make sure that I write it accordingly? What I would recommend is when doing your journal search and finding the right journal for your manuscript, which is a topic that we'll explore in further depth in another course, in another unit, you take you make a list for yourself of 1, 2, 3, that you have 3 journals. So you're ready to submit to a specific journal. You know that if it gets accepted there, wonderful. If it doesn't get accepted, we go straight to the second journal and you haven't lost any time. And of course, when you're writing your paper, you know where you're intending it to go. Now, the third major issue is that the procedures or analyses are seen as defective. And this obviously relates to the heart of our research itself and making sure that we have the methodology down and that the practices that we're using are the most up to date and are taking into account the current best practices in our field, making sure that we understand the literature review and how to approach the issues that we're approaching. Obviously, this is not something that can be done post facto, after the article is already, the study has been completed and the article has been done. This needs to be done already at the way beginning. And the best way to, I would say, the best advice that I could give in order to make sure that this is done properly is really to share your research with your colleagues, with your peers in the field. Share your idea with them, see what they think. Oftentimes in different countries, different methodologies are used. So make sure that we're reading up. If we talked about which journals to send to, we want to be reading those journals that we intend to submit to. And that'll give us an impression of what types of articles are they interested, what types of methodologies are used, and if it's going to be appropriate for our study. The conclusions aren't justified. And for this example, for this issue number 4, I want to tell a quick story about one of the scholars that we worked with, who's a very brilliant scholar in her own right. And she, her research, among other things, focuses on education. She's an educator, and she wants to study how children learn inside versus how they learn outside. A very seemingly simple study to conduct. And she did interviews, and she watched classes for a certain period of time. And what happened was, she wrote the paper, we helped her edit it and send it off, and the review from the peer reviewers and from the journal was that the article jumped to conclusions that weren't based on the evidence and the facts that she collected. So in terms of the study itself, they said it was excellent, but they had a problem with the fact that she wanted to learn about, she tried to take her paper and tried to take her study and extrapolate from there to all other sorts of settings and socioeconomic backgrounds and different outdoor and indoor settings, which weren't necessarily justified. So we need to make sure that we're careful. And one of the best ways to do this is in our conclusion section, we can say we have suggestions for further research, or this, we know that there were certain factors that inhibited us from being able to do the ideal study that we would have liked to do. Maybe the number of patients, we would have loved to do more, but we don't have the funding for, for doing it as well as we would have liked to do. And we suggested this further research. And as long as we're being honest and open about that, it's generally okay. What we don't want is this situation whereby we try to hide those figures and facts, and then they come back to bite us because the reviewers say, wait, what's going on here? And that's really important to keep in mind when we're completing our paper. Another issue that's very common is how novel is the thesis? Maybe one of the most common responses we see from journals when our clients submit their papers is that the article's interesting. It's, it may organize the literature in a new way. It may be thorough, but it's not novel enough. It doesn't bring enough of a new perspective in order for us to consider really publishing this paper. Now, oftentimes that's a template throwaway line that the journals send us just to get us off their backs. They don't want to accept it. They have too many studies that they want to publish, so they write, it's not novel enough. But sometimes it's really true. Sometimes we need to look back and ask ourselves hard questions about, okay, how does my study differ from other studies that are out there? And B, have I done a good enough job of explaining the difference between my study and those that preceded me, or those that are doing the same study in parallel? Now, I just brought one example here. Maybe it's a bit of an extreme example, but if our thesis is eating fast food is bad and should be avoided, we're not giving enough details and enough instruction to the editors to say, okay, what are you really trying to tell me? However, if we say something more detailed, like Americans should eliminate the regular consumption of fast food because a fast food diet leads to preventable and expensive health issues such as diabetes, obesity, and heart disease, then we've explained ourselves, we've gone into some detail, and obviously our study needs to back this up. But it shows that there's something that differentiates this study from studies that have preceded it. Now, the sixth secret to why your article might be rejected really has to do with language. But when I want to talk about language, it's not just whether we have our I's dotted and our T's crossed and if we have the periods in the right place, but rather it's a way of writing. And there's a tendency within academia to write very convoluted, complex, hard to understand sentences. And this is one extreme example from Professor Judith Butler, famous philosopher and women's studies scholar. And she maybe can get away with it because of her stature, but this is one sentence that she wrote, which if you understand it, kudos to you. And this is published in a journal. And it was later challenged as a question of should this be the accepted academic writing in terms of how much are we supposed to understand what it is that's written. And I think at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about the clinical professions or very practical fields, it's very important to write in a way which will be understood by the reader and not just understood by ourselves and maybe our small peer group. And that's especially true if we're submitting to a journal which is supposed to have a broad audience, whereby it's even more important that our writing is clear. And so what does that mean? So in practice, it means obviously doing as much practice as you possibly can with academic writing and getting into the groove of understanding IMRAD. That's, how to structure your article in terms of the introduction, discussion, conclusion, making sure that everything in the literature review, making sure that everything is in the right order. But also within those sections, making sure that our writing is clear, it flows nicely, and obviously that there aren't critical language errors and issues that come up in our writing. And the seventh and final issue that journal editors talk about is it simply didn't make the cut. And what does that mean? And maybe this should give us a little bit of, it should make us feel a little bit better about ourselves in that we oftentimes look for reasons why our article wasn't accepted. Sometimes there just isn't enough room. And it would have made it had there been less submissions or had there been other different people who submitted instead of us. And therefore, it's important for us not to get down on ourselves. What I really loved is I saw a study recently which looked at what editors and journal reviewers or article reviewers look at when they're reviewing our paper. What is peer review, essentially? And what I was, I guess, surprised to learn is that the vast majority of scholars or of peer reviewers are looking at just the title. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If an average top-level journal is getting hundreds of submissions a year and there's only one desk editor, they're not reading through every single article in depth and checking every reference. So what does that mean? That means that we want to spend the most amount of time working on our title, having it something that jumps out at you, something that's sexy, something that speaks to the reader right away. I understand clearly what field it's in, what's new, what's novel, and I can give that over in one line, maybe one title, and then a subtitle. Beyond that, an abstract. That's the next thing that peer reviewers read. So in terms of the abstract, oftentimes we get distracted by the article itself, and we forget, and at the last second we write an abstract. And then we wonder, wait, what happened? Why didn't my paper get accepted? Well, it could be because the abstract didn't do a clear enough job of explaining and demonstrating what you were looking to do. And what makes an abstract unique is that as opposed to, let's say, a literary piece, whereby we want to keep the secrets and keep the big news till the end, in a scientific abstract, we want to say already in the abstract what we did, how we did it, and what conclusions we came to. We're not leaving anything for the surprise of the reader. The reader should know exactly what they're getting into before they get into it. And then obviously our hope and goal is that the scholars make it to the point where they're, or the peer reviewers are making it to the point where they're actually reading the paper and taking it seriously. And then if it's written well, giving ourselves a good chance to succeed. So how do we actually climb this mountain? We've presented in this short introductory webinar some of the principles for why articles are rejected. So the goal of this Kickstart Your Career Chemist webinar series is really to spend time on each of the topics that we've discussed today, as well as additional topics, from how you find a journal article, how do you respond to the comments from reviewers, how do you write a paper, what's the structure of writing an academic paper, what should go into a cover letter, what shouldn't, how do I understand, how do I really go through the sections of author's guidelines and understand what in the world do they want from me. If I get a rejection, what's the difference between different kinds of a rejection versus a revise and resubmit? And many other topics that we're going to discuss and we're going to cover in the hopes that it really makes some order. These might have been concepts that you've heard or that you've interacted with or over time, but to really organize it in your head to make sure that from the time you start your study, you're already thinking about, okay, how am I going to publish it? Where am I going to publish it? And how do I build my research and write my paper in a way which having the goal in mind already from the start. And if you view things that way, and if you know what pitfalls to avoid along the way, then you're giving yourself a much, much higher chance of having your paper published in the journal of your dreams. And in the end of the day, that's the goal. That's what's going to help you to not only spread your research to your colleagues and to your peers and to maybe even the greater society, but also help you personally promote yourself as a researcher, advance your career, and develop new partnerships and collaborations and opportunities that wouldn't have been available to you ahead of time. So I want to thank you for joining me for this introductory session. I very much hope to see you. Please don't hesitate to be in touch and to reach out if there's anything that you want more information for or have questions about. I'm available. So thank you so much for joining me, and we look forward to meeting you over the course of the webinar series, and wishing you the best of health.